This is the story of Idi Amin, the craziest dictator in modern history. Yes, it's time for my yearly Dictator video. And I know that if some of you had your way, this entire channel would be Dictator videos. But I think these ones mean more when you have to sit through my videos about poop and pee in between. Idi Amin was born sometime around 1928 in the nation of Uganda, which at the time was a protectorate of the British Empire, which is supposedly a step above being a colony, although that didn't stop Britain from recruiting 77,000 Ugandan soldiers to fight for them when World War II rolled around. Among those soldiers was Idi Amin, who actually joined as an assistant cook, but received military training in case things got really bad. But he enjoyed the military, so Idi Amin stuck around after the war was over and rose through the ranks, becoming a warrant officer by 1959, which was the highest rank allowed for a black soldier. That is until 1962, when Uganda gained independence from Britain and Idi Amin was quickly promoted, despite the fact that his only real military experience was putting down a few rebellions. In fact, his actions during those rebellions were so violent that the British government had even demanded that he be prosecuted for war crimes. And colonial Britain calling you a war criminal is a bit like a Russian telling you you're an alcoholic. But the Ugandan government heard their suggestion to prosecute Idi Amin and said, "That's a great idea, but we're actually going to make him commander of all armed forces instead." So by 1965, he was serving alongside Ugandan Prime Minister Milton Obote, although the two of them were both technically below the symbolic king Mutesa II. And even though the king was essentially powerless, Idi Amin and Milton Obote decided to overthrow him for the hell of it. So they launched a coup, sent the king into exile, and made Obote the new president of Uganda while Amin ruled alongside him as commander of the military. Which was a great idea, because dictators famously love sharing power. And sure enough, they quickly turned on each other. In January of 1971, when Obote was visiting Singapore, Idi Amin launched a coup against Obote, exiled him to Tanzania, and became the sole leader of Uganda. And this is where things got bad. Amin originally promised that his military government would be a temporary solution until they could hold elections, a lie that he maintained for about 1 week before declaring himself president and suspending the constitution. He then proceeded to arrest, torture, or kill his political opponents, a cornerstone of any good dictatorship. But these killings became very frequent, to the point that Idi Amin was basically murdering any civilian who spoke out against him. It's estimated that over the course of 8 years, he had around 300,000 people killed. And honestly, as a dictator you can get away with a couple thousand, but 300K is just pushing your luck. It got to be so bad that he earned the nickname the Butcher of Uganda. And these were not your normal run-of-the-mill political assassinations. Idi Amin was killing people in accordance with his tribe's rituals. And sadly, he was not a member of the Humane Lethal Injections tribe. He believed that cutting a piece of flesh from the victim's body or tasting the victim's blood would subdue the spirit of the dead person. Feel like that would just kind of annoy the spirit of the dead person, but what do I know? He was also known to decapitate his political enemies and keep their heads in his freezer. Yeah, just go ahead and push that aside. The fish sticks are back there somewhere. One member of Idi Amin's cabinet later reported that the dictator would even go so far as to eat human flesh. But don't worry, Idi Amin himself denied this, saying that human flesh was, quote, too salty. Great. Let's not think too much about how he knows that. So what was Uganda like while Idi Amin was in power? Well, in an attempt to give the nation back to Ugandans, Idi Amin kicked 80,000 South Asian people out of the country. Unfortunately, the people he kicked out were largely business owners who accounted for 90% of the nation's tax revenue, so Uganda instantly fell into a horrible recession, meaning he permanently crippled the economy to give it back to the people. Thank you, Mr. President. Unfortunately, that was the only thing given to the people, because Idi Amin abolished civilian government functions as he turned the nation into a military dictatorship. Uganda's parliament was quickly suspended, and government positions were given to military officers that Idi Amin felt were loyal to him. But I guess he was a bad judge of character, because many of them fled the country as soon as they could. Those who remained lived in constant fear of Idi Amin, who would have everyone monitored by the State Research Bureau, his personal intelligence agency. Although there wasn't much intelligence involved, because they would simply kidnap and kill anyone Amin didn't like. None of this helped Uganda's relationship with other countries, who gradually distanced themselves from Idi Amin. Especially uncomfortable with the whole thing was Great Britain, who had supported Amin for the first year of his rule before realizing he was insane. The loss of their support infuriated Amin, who responded by exiling all British people and giving British-owned businesses to Ugandans. And my apologies to the Ugandan who had to run a baked beans and potato stand in Kampala. In late 1973, when Britain was going through a recession, Idi Amin launched a Save Britain Fund, offering emergency supplies to, quote, save and assist our former colonial masters from economic catastrophe. And I do have to hand it to him, that's actually a very good bit. But things got really bad for Uganda's international relations in 1976, when an Air France flight was hijacked by Palestinian and German revolutionaries and landed in Uganda. And this was not some secret landing. Idi Amin personally welcomed the hijackers to Uganda and even provided military support for them. The hijackers then released most of the passengers, but kept 84 Israelis who were on the flight, publicly threatening to kill them if Israel did not release certain political prisoners. While Israel debated what to do, the hostages were held in Uganda's only international airport. And in the midst of all this, the only person having a great time was Idi Amin, who would visit the hostages daily and give them updates on the whole thing. And if being kidnapped by hijackers wasn't terrifying enough, now you have to get your daily news from the Butcher of Uganda. A week after the hijacking, on the night of June 3, 1976, Israeli commandos flew into Uganda to conduct a rescue mission for the hostages. Honestly, I could do a whole video on this, but I'll just give you the highlights. The commandos landed outside the airport with cargo planes containing several Land Rovers and a Mercedes that looked like Idi Amin's. They brought this all just to get past the airport guards, who would see the vehicles and assume it was Amin's entourage. Unfortunately, that didn't work because Idi Amin had recently bought a different color Mercedes, so the Israelis just shot the guards instead. They then entered the airport, killed the hijackers, and started loading the hostages onto their planes. Ugandan soldiers started shooting at the group, causing a firefight before the group was able to escape. All 7 hijackers were killed, as well as 45 Ugandan soldiers and 4 of the hostages. Only 1 Israeli soldier was killed, who happened to be the older brother of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, a completely uncontroversial person for me to mention. Let's move on. Idi Amin was absolutely furious about the raid, saying that he could have stopped them if he knew they were coming. Well, that's why they didn't tell you. Because the Israelis had been assisted by the nation of Kenya, Idi Amin ordered the murder of all Kenyans in Uganda. 245 Kenyans were killed, while around 3,000 were able to flee the country. All of this took place a month after the Ugandan Defense Council declared Idi Amin president for life, which was great timing because he was clearly in a very calm and rational headspace. In fact, his insanity was only getting worse. Furious that the UK had cut him off, Idi Amin declared himself Conqueror of the British Empire, or CBE for short. That was pretty much his favorite hobby, giving himself random medals and titles that everyone had to address him by. And it got so bad that his full title eventually became His Excellency, President for Life, Field Marshal Al-Haji Dr. Idi Amin Dada, VC, DSO, MC, CBE, Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the seas, and conqueror of the British Empire in Africa in general and Uganda in particular. Glad he included the fish in there. We don't want them getting any thoughts of rebellion. By 1977, everyone was pretty sick of this guy. At this point, they were probably less afraid of him and more annoyed by his antics. Soldiers were constantly trying to launch coups against him, but everyone knows you can't coup a professional couper. Idi Amin constantly restructured his own control of the military to avoid giving anyone else too much power. When Vice President Mustafa Adrisi was injured in a car accident and had to be flown to Cairo for treatment, Idi Amin demoted him while he was out of the country. Some citizens believed the car accident had been orchestrated by Idi Amin. Although I think that's a bit too fancy for him. He'd rather just decapitate the guy. Still, in November of 1978, troops loyal to Idrisi revolted, which prompted Idi Amin to send other troops to put down the rebellion. And when the revolters fled into the neighboring Tanzania, Idi Amin's troops followed them. Tensions between Uganda and Tanzania had been growing in recent months, with Idi Amin teasing the idea of invading them. So whether or not Idi Amin specifically ordered an invasion, all this tension caused a war to break out between the two countries. At which point Amin announced his intention to annex a chunk of Tanzania, which might have just been him trying to cover up the fact that this war started basically on accident. And even though he was lord of all the beasts of the earth, he had lost control of most of his soldiers, resulting in a disjointed Ugandan military. Realizing he was probably going to lose this battle, Idi Amin suggested that he and the president of Tanzania should have a public boxing match to decide the outcome of the war, with Muhammad Ali acting as the referee. And God, I wish that actually happened. Instead, the Tanzanian military expelled Amin's forces and then moved into Uganda, advancing on the capital and forcing Idi Amin to flee by helicopter to the east of the nation. There, he attempted to raise an army to take back the capital, but everyone was so tired of his bullshit that he was forced to flee the country entirely. And so began the exile of Idi Amin. At first, it was unclear where exactly he was, prompting the American magazine Soldier of Fortune to offer a $10,000 bounty to anyone who could provide information to capture him. Very generous, guys, thank you. I wasn't gonna turn him in, but I'm tempted now that I know I could pay off my car. In fact, he was originally in Libya, where he spent a year under the support of his friend Muammar Gaddafi. In 1980, he was taken in by Saudi Arabia, who agreed to provide free housing and pay him a generous stipend in exchange for him staying out of politics. Which begs the question, why? Well, Saudi Arabia was essentially doing this in an act of Islamic solidarity. Yes, it might be hard to believe, but Idi Amin was officially Muslim. No mention of that in his long title where he declared himself Lord. But as long as he kept his mouth shut and didn't do anything political, Saudi Arabia would take care of him. And so he did, spending several years living in the top 2 floors of a hotel in Jeddah, where he had multiple wives and multiple children. And even though he didn't speak out publicly, he was secretly funding rebel groups in Uganda to keep fighting for him. The man cannot resist a good coup. Meanwhile, with Idi Amin out of the picture, who did Uganda turn to lead their nation? None other than Milton Obote, the exiled president who Idi Amin had once betrayed. That's a nice full circle moment right there. Unfortunately, his regime was just as brutal as Idi Amin's, with another estimated 300,000 civilian deaths before Obote was also overthrown and forced into exile. While Uganda was in a state of unrest, Idi Amin abruptly left his exile and flew to Zaire, preparing to mobilize a rebellion to take back Uganda. But when he landed in Zaire, he was immediately arrested. I guess Mobutu decided there was only room for one insane dictator in his country. The Grain of Salt cinematic universe continues to expand. Saudi Arabia was reluctant to let Amin return after he snuck away from them, but they ultimately relented. Zaire shipped him back to his exile before his rebellion could even start. Such a shame, too, because I feel like he was just on the cusp of fixing Uganda. In 2002, declassified British documents revealed that Idi Amin's original coup against Milton Obote was supported by Israel, who wanted to stop Obote from bringing peace to South Sudan to prevent South Sudan from backing Palestine, which feels like an MCU post-credits scene teasing the villain of the next movie. As for Uganda, the military commander who took over in 1986 promised a return to democracy for the country. And just to check in on that, he's actually still the president to this day after bribing parliament to abolish term limits and holding multiple fraudulent elections. Just once, I'd like to end one of these dictator videos saying that the country is in great shape. Maybe next year. Idi Amin spent the rest of his life in Jeddah, dying in 2003 at the age of 75. He was survived by an estimated 45 to 60 children. Good lord. Then again, I guess you don't earn this many titles without impressing a few ladies. Now please consider subscribing, or I'll make you run a baked beans and potato stand in Kampala.